Hey, hello, happy Friday. If you have watched either my discussion on natural beauty or my video about my kind of critiques on the self-help genre and where I kind of direct my attention instead, I think this is going to be right up your alley, especially as it also kind of folds in an interest in exploring online culture and guru culture and the kind of aspirational Instagram culture. And as someone who admittedly did spend hours with a former coworker gleefully kind of chuckling at the Gwyneth Paltrow cookbook, I was eager to jump into The Glow by Jessie Gaynor. Now, this is either going to be very quick and succinct, or it's going to be kind of ambling and drawn out. I guess there is always the third option that I am completely wrong, so we'll see what it is. But I was really intrigued by this book because I'm fascinated by things that really dig into the heart of especially online culture in a way that I don't think has been really fully examined within literature. And I think there is a difficulty there because we are looking at a medium, one that moves very quick if we're talking about things like social media. And I think there's also this idea, especially in literary fiction, that potentially if we pin ourselves too closely into one time, we lose some universality or we become dated very quickly. And as we all know, social media moves very quickly. However, I do think that when we stay away from these topics, we're losing relevancy from modern audiences, and especially like Gen Z. Now, I am not an expert on generations by any means, nor do I want to be. However, I do think we have to acknowledge the unique experience of Gen Z and how they've really grown up enmeshed in social media and how that shapes perception and worldview. And I was really intrigued by even the cover of this book, which I really do think kind of fits that Instagram aesthetic. And I'm going to be honest with you in a way that social media is often viewed as a filtered kind of reflection of reality and experience, right? Because in many ways it is. I can't decide if this was an ingenious kind of cutting social commentary, social satire, or if it was completely asinine. In the way that I feel like if I was studying this in like a small workshop setting, I would be told I just don't get it, but I don't know that it ultimately goes far enough for me at the end of the day. So this follows Jane, a PR professional who's kind of going through the motions. She is saddled with a ridiculous amount of medical debt due to like a surprise removal of her appendix, and that has really forced her to kind of stay in this position that she really doesn't enjoy for the health insurance. She's selling really kind of superficial wellness products, and we're kind of enmeshed in that kind of wellness speak from the beginning, but in a very self-aware way, in the sense that this voice and this tone really is kind of brash and abrasive. It wants us to question Jane in a lot of ways. And yes, I do think that the selection of Jane as a name was for the plain Jane kind of comparisons, though they are never made through the text. But she's kind of just putting in the motion. She's not really working, and she is being called up by her boss basically because her computer activity has been monitored and they have found her basically stalking her ex-boyfriend's girlfriend. And so she has to pitch on the fly like something that will keep them interested in her, something that will show that she is an asset to this brand. And so she says that she is looking for wellness experiences to add to their portfolio. And this means she has to go to Instagram and kind of source wellness experiences because of course she wasn't doing that. She was stalking her boyfriend's ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend. And so she comes across this retreat called Fort Path and basically schedules a weekend at this place because she is attracted, drawn to the kind of enigmatic leader Cass, who according to the text is a kind of stereotypical willowy Instagram beauty. And there's this sense of her being aspirational. And this is one of the tricks of the form, is kind of communicating Cass's draw in a way and a form that is so different from that experience. We do get the exploration of Jane's insecurity on so many different levels as a way of kind of explaining this, but we also get the sense that Jane is ultimately kind of unimpressed by it all, even as she is drawn to Cass. And it's this idea of, is she attracted to Cass? Does she just want to be Cass? What is that? And I think that that is one of the things that the book is interested in exploring, but doesn't ultimately succeed at. And maybe it's just that I am not attracted to these kind of experiences, but I don't understand the draw of the Instagram Instagram as it was kind of communicated to us at all. Also forgive if we have any light flashes because I have a light bulb that is surely about to go out, but I just haven't changed it yet because we're gonna get every bit of function from the light bulb that we can. Anyway, so she ends up going to this retreat. She meets Cass and she meets Cass's husband, Tom, and Cass and Tom's relationship is kind of unconventional, as is the whole retreat. It's a very stereotypical wellness retreat as it is portrayed, and the way it's written makes it kind of hard to read whether it's satire or not. I think Gaynor's voice is incredibly strong in that it's really sharp and readable. However, there are moments or times like this, or the whole book really, where it's kind of unclear, and that may be part of the point, to be fair, in the whole you just don't get it of it all. But it wasn't clear to me completely whether this was satire or earnest or a combination of the two, and I didn't fully buy it as satire because it didn't seem to go extreme enough in its ultimate exploration and commentary through that satire. Plot was kind of ambling, and part of that may be an ultimate, like, higher level reflection on the millennial experience, this idea that she ends up over the course of this weekend getting fired from her job, but she is desperate for this medical insurance, dependent on this insurance, and so she basically begs Tom and Cass for a job, and so she turns Cass and this retreat, which, while seemingly flying under the radar in the sense that there isn't a huge social media following, is well known enough within certain circles in the city that on a date, Jane had a guide tell her that it's a cult. And so she's attempting to turn this retreat into the next big wellness fad. And it does have those markers of satire in a lot of the language of everything, a lot of the kind of parody of wellness language, the emptiness of the language. I do think that that is one of the challenges as well. I've talked again and again about how I personally really struggle with self-help kind of language because it feels so empty to me at certain times. And then here we have these added layers of the kind of like wellness culture, and it dips its toes into some of these conversations. It talks about the whiteness of these spaces and the language that kind of reinforces this without blatantly enforcing it. It talks about how a lot of the language around food and nourishment and wellness in that area also could be mirror images of conversations around ED. And it does attempt to delve in to the kind of emptiness of these experiences, this idea of sitting in silence, and the kind of schedule of the weekend is one of the biggest indicators of the potential satire going on here, but I don't know that it ultimately pushes into these conversations enough, and I think where this is the most evident is in Cass herself. I read the book, I also downloaded the audiobook to try and get a better sense of things through the performance of it, and I had a really, really hard time pinning down Cass, and as this kind of almost Gwyneth Paltrow-esque character, let's be real, it's already going to be kind of hard to pin her down, I think, and it's teetering on critique and parody, but also still being insightful to the character, and I think the characters are somewhat lackluster for me here, because the superficiality of the characters, while ultimately explored in the narrative, is also hidden a little bit by the kind of bluntness of the narrative, this idea that we are looking at the messier bits, the uglier bits of these characters. We do have these moments of kind of like shock value within the narrative. And I think in some ways that tricks us as readers into thinking that these characters are deeper and more interesting than I ultimately felt they were. And Cass in particular was really difficult, like I said, for me, because she's this enigmatic leader while also not being a leader in any way, and that is part of what the book is exploring. But she's aspirational enough to Jane in particular that Jane is drawn to her and ultimately wants to be her, is jealous of her and the power that she wields, because Jane in the course of the book is really honest and blunt about her insecurity, and I think that insecurity is the most interesting part of this, because at the heart we really are exploring very insecure people that have this perception that they have everything figured out, but it doesn't fully get there. And at the end of the day, we have these kind of harsh explorations of these characters that feel true, but we never get to the truth and the heart of them. And again, that may be a social commentary, that may be a reflection of the current moment, but I don't think it ultimately succeeds, in part because that is combined with a plot that doesn't really go anywhere. So our character work isn't really pushing anywhere. It's pretty stagnant ultimately at the end of the day, synonyms, and the plot itself isn't really going anywhere. We're kind of stuck in this stagnation. And while our characters are ultimately stuck in this stagnation as well, and there is a layer of interest there in this idea of this wellness culture, this idea that you are constantly self-improving and pushing forward, or that's the goal, but ultimately you are sitting in this stagnant state at the end of the day. There is something interesting there. I absolutely believe that, but the course of the novel never really gets there. And I think part of it may be that the timeline is a little confused. The first about half of the book, which is only a little over 300 pages, really focuses on that first initial weekend. And then after that, we really speed through a large chunk of time. And it's never really clear what Jane wants. Her kind of teaming up with Cass and Tom feels a lot out of necessity. She obviously kind of has this light obsession with Cass, and this combined with her kind of own insecurity really makes it so she wants to position herself to be the most important person, so to speak, in this group. But we see a Jane that has like no ambition at the beginning, really at the end of the day. And over the course of this, we don't necessarily see more ambition in her, and yet we see her trying to push this retreat to new heights, and it never really meshes. And so between the plot and the character work, it's really unclear where everything is going. And in combination with that, while the kind of social media aspect of it was something that really drew me in, and we do see it early on with Jane being drawn to this retreat social media page, being drawn to Cass specifically through the social media page, we lose sight of that very quickly, and we don't really interrogate or engage with that idea of online personas to its fullest potential. It doesn't feel like something new and fresh within the narrative. We do explore the idea of Jane being different people. We talk about PR Jane, and then the Jane she becomes over the course of pushing and being the PR person for this retreat, and there is some kind of dissonance there, or exploring the different personas and the dissonance within presenting these different personas outwardly. However, this dissonance reads to me as this kind of attempt at rawness or edginess presented to me as a reader, rather than really engaging with the emotional truth of that. And I think a lot of this is very surface level, and like I said, there is interesting commentary there in the idea of all of this being surface level, but I really wanted it to get to the heart of these questions. Talk about this idea of pretty privilege and the currency of being beautiful, and how when you do have this cultural currency, there's more buy-in when you are spewing absolute nonsense about zucchinis online, or talking about breathing in light. And things are pushed to their extreme here in the kind of form of satire, in a way of exploring some of this, but it never really gets at the heart of these things. It never feels fully formed, and I would have loved for it really to dig into the meat and potatoes of a lot of this. Meat and potatoes being something not on the menu in this book. Because at the end of the day for me, and it may just be that I am not at all the target audience here, which is valid and fair, but Cass feels like a parody. I don't buy in to her allure. And there is that struggle of communicating that allure through the page, but there is just no substance there. And I do think this book is interested in exploring that lack of substance, that is part of what it is in conversation with. I just don't think that conversation is as fully formed as it could be, or it thinks it is. And ultimately because of that, I really struggled with it. At a certain point, it was just no longer interesting hearing Jane's more like abrasive inner monologue, inner thoughts, though we weren't from the first person here. In some ways, though not nearly to the same degree, I thought of one of my biggest literary disappointments, maybe ever, The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P. Because that book was really talked about like it was going to be an exploration, or it was written to be an exploration of modern dating. And that book, which came out in the 2010s, had absolutely no mentions of online dating, and like barely had cell phones in it. And in some ways, this feels similar. It wants to engage with the online culture, with those conversations, and yet it wants to keep itself just removed enough that it feels like it doesn't lose relevancy, but instead I think it robs what's going on here of any real relevancy. I almost wonder if it would have been better as a short story. I think it would have given it a little bit more room room for those questions to be a little bit more open-ended. I think the abrasiveness of the voice would have read a little bit more searing, a little bit more insightful potentially there. It would have packed a little bit more of a punch, because here it just kind of fizzled and petered out. And again, that may have been part of the point, but ultimately for me, I just don't think that was as successful a way of exploring it. And it's hard not to read this and compare it in some way mentally to Natural Beauty, which I read earlier this year. That book is by no means perfect either. It does kind of come up short in some of its conversations. However, I do think personally that it was just a little bit more interesting in both its form, its style, and those conversations it was having than this was for me. And again, I do think there were intentions of satire here. I just don't think for me personally it ultimately succeeded in that. And at the end of the day, as always, that is but my opinion. So let me know your opinion if you've read this below. As always, thank you for hanging out and listening to mine. Like, subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, and yeah, bye.